Hello everyone. My name is Nick Richmond. I'm one of the directors of Tricordant and I lead for organization design. And it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Tijinski and Alistair Mitchell-Baker, who'll be facilitating the whole scale change training on the 19th, 20th and 21st of June. I've asked them to sit down with me just to answer a few questions about this, about large group interventions and the whole scale change training and about the event itself. So I'm going to start off with Paul and just ask him about, what is your experience of whole-scale change and of large group interventions themselves? And maybe you want to share a little bit about what LGIs are and whole-scale change.
Thank you, Nick. Whole-scale change, large group interventions as a whole, as a category of activities, which includes whole-scale, real-time strategic change, future search, right? Search, future search, and all of these methodologies, I think, came about as a consequence of two important questions, right, that we were pursuing back 20, 30 years ago. The first was, why do the few have to decide for the many? Why can't the many decide for themselves, right? And, and most of us, we were used to working with small groups. We all came from a small group dynamic perspective and training. And so this question of how could the many decide for themselves, right? Could you not replicate what you do in a small group in a bigger context? And that was the first question. The second question was actually posed by a client of mine who said, we're being asked to reduce our cycle time. Right? We're being asked to produce products in half the time, right, and get them to market in half the time. Why is it that change has to take so long? Why can't we move faster, right? Why does it have to take 2 or 3 years to create transformation? And I thought, it was an arbitrary sort of notion when somebody would say, well, how long is it going to take? We'd say 2 or 3 years. Right? Not because there was scientific proof or evidence of it, but because we didn't really know any better, right? And so this question of how did the many decide for themselves? And then, of course, if you engage a lot of people, how do you move fast? I mean, that seems like it would slow things down, right? And so large group interventions and whole-scale change in particular came about as a consequence of trying to answer those two questions, right? And the term whole scale is really, it's whole hyphen scale. And the whole is whole system. How do you engage the whole system, a constellation of stakeholders, et cetera, in the conversation about whatever needs to change, whether it's strategy, structure, or whatever, right? And the scale is, sometimes it's big, right? Everybody was enamored with large, right? Hundreds of people, but oftentimes the scale is small, right? We don't always have the ability to bring hundreds of people together, whether it's virtually or face-to-face. So the whole is whole system, always, and the scale is large or small, right? And how do you manage that? That's really the context within which I think we had the conversation, right? Why do the few have to decide for the many? Why can't they decide for themselves? What might that look like and how might we do it? And that's the genesis of whole scale.
And what about was that, Paul? Because, when you read the books, the whole scale change and large group interventions have been around for many years. Am I right in remembering whole scale change itself is initially formed back out in the 1980s?
Yes. In the 80s, if you go back that far, there were forums and conversations among practitioners from across the range of org design and org development about this whole question of, how do we engage people? How do we reimagine how we do this? Underlying it all is ownership and commitment. How do we build ownership and commitment on the part of people? And so whatever methodology you look at, open space, future search, real-time strategic change, whole-scale change, they're all about building ownership and commitment, right? And engaging people in whatever the relevant conversations are. And so there was a lot of comparisons, right? There was a lot of collaboration amongst us because we were all experimenting, and the genesis of whole scale really comes from, right, Robert Jacobs wrote a book called Real-Time Strategic Change. And in mostly the application that Kathy Dannemiller, my old partner, had been used to is strategy deployment from her work at Ford Motor. So the real-time strategic was about how do you deploy strategy in a way that creates execution faster, right?
Yeah.
But strategy is only one challenge. Structures, processes, people issues, all these other things are also. And so whole scale comes out of the exploration of how else could we apply it and what else could we work on that would be relevant, and then how would we do that, right? So in any whole scale event, you might find some elements of future search, some elements of open space, some elements of RTSC, right? Because it was a collaboration, it was an exploration on the part of all of us.
Yeah. Just to kind of flip to Alistair and just ask him about his experience and the Tricordant experience of using LGIs and whole scale change. I don't think we could say that we're purists in the way that we apply these things, but Alistair, your thoughts and your experiences?
In today's context, which has those questions still resound. Why should the few decide for the many? How can we reduce cycle times? I think that latter question is even more acute now with the pace required in the current world, where the level of complexity, ambiguity, change feels like it's even greater. And I guess the other issue that I think LGIs particularly bring us to is tackling wicked issues, polarities, the kind of tensions that are at the heart of a lot of what organizations are struggling with. So whether it's in org design, org development, we use, as you say, blended LGIs a lot in our work in Tricordant. We've been trained in formally trained in a number of different processes usually by the people who originated these processes, whether it's Sandra Janoff and Future Search or Jake Jacobs with RT SC, etc. But I think it is all about how to create that sense of support people with sense making on a collective level, and build that sense of commitment for change, because the underlying principle, as we all know, is people support what they help to create. Now, the interesting questions to me are finding clients who are willing to support that, given the challenge it can have on the power dynamics and within organizations. But we found it's a really powerful and effective approach, and I couldn't imagine us doing without it. And I think I'm really excited that our team, together with the folks who are going to come and join us with Paul, are going to learn even more around whole scale change and the insights that brings as well.
Yeah, and I think the other part to the power piece that you're talking about, there's also the demand on people's time. It just seems to be shorter and shorter, and so I certainly hear from many organizations and leaders saying, well, we've still got to do the day job and we've got to transition to the future, and they're trying to work that out. And I think whole scale change in LGIs, although they do require some significant investment of people's time early on, you actually reduce the amount of change requirement going forward, because there's that old saying that says the organization always pays. And the bit that I like to add on is it either pays now or it pays later. Later is always greater.
If I could build on that for 1 second, Nick, because you go back to cycle time, right? Full scale change in these large group intervention methodologies reduce cycle time to ownership and commitment and to implementation, right? creating the solution is easy. Building ownership and commitment and
Yeah.
execution, that's where the cycle time difference is. And so when I have conversations with clients, it said if you want, you can get to the future faster using these methodologies, right? You can get to a solution quickly. That's easy. But the rest of the time, 90% of the time is selling it, convincing people to it, explaining the why of it. Whereas if you did all that as a part of the process, you wouldn't have to do it at the back end, right? So it's always a fascinating point because it feels like you go slower to go faster.
Yeah.
Right.
Paul, what will people learn during the whole scale change event in June?
The first answer to that question is possibilities.
Yeah.
Right? It's possibilities. I think what you'll learn in this workshop is how to reimagine your work, moving from 25, 30, 50 people to something bigger, right?
Yeah.
Whether that bigger is everybody in the room at one time or ways of engaging the system so that you continue to expand engagement and involvement so that you get to critical mass, right? So the first answer is you can reimagine the meetings that you design from how you design them and who you design them with to what you could actually do in them, right? From a creative point of view, how would you use simulations or Lego serious play or dialogue or conversation, right? How do you get 20 tables of 8 to converge and align and agree on one solution walking out of the room? How could you do that? And so the answer, I think, is possibilities. We're going to help you reimagine how you might do it, why you might do it, and how you ensure that it's successful, right? I've never done a large group meeting in 30 years that wasn't a success. And it's not by chance. There's a methodology for ensuring that the conversations are the right ones with the right people, right?
Yeah.
That it just doesn't fail, right? And
Yeah.
I don't mean that arrogantly or egotistically, but within the whole scale change methodology, there's a way of engaging the system that ensures the greater likelihood of success, minimizes the risk of bringing hundreds of people together and having them make a bad decision. I think that's the key.
Yes, that real intentionality behind it and that ongoing learning and built-in continuous improvement into the methodology itself.
Right.
That ensures that you course correct on the way through, as opposed to coming to the end and going, well, that didn't quite work out, did it? And so you're always going to land in the right place.
Yeah.
I really get that.
And the other thing about whole scale change, what we'll talk a lot about is, when you imagine a large group intervention, the first question is, who's the large group? What's the constellation of stakeholders? And how do you imagine what voices need to be in the conversation in order to ensure the ownership and commitment that Alistair was talking about, right? So, we'll talk a lot about how do you imagine the constellation? How do you map the ecosystem? Right? How do you embrace the complexity of the world today, whether it's from a people or a process point of view, right? In a way that brings it all together.
So what would people actually experience on each of the days? What types of experiences could you describe, Paul?
Day one is largely about understanding the principles and the theory and beginning to experiment with, if I had to design an intervention, right, which could be one meeting or a series of meetings, how would I begin that in the whole scale change context? Right? What would we do? How do we think about it? So day one is a little bit about the models and the notions about how you would do it. Each of the 3 days is grounded in a case. So we're going to work on real situations. Alistair and I and others will share examples of large group interventions that we've done. But the idea in the workshop is each day we'll be working on a case where you apply what we talk about to a real situation. It could be one you bring, could be one that resonates for you that somebody else brought, right? So day one is a little bit about theory and principles and beginning to understand the process and the practice of full scale. Day two is really a deep dive into what could you do and how could you do it, right? I mean, how do 300 people decide on one solution together? What does that look like mechanically, right? What's the process? What's the methodology? We have some videos to show what that might look like, and we'll give people an opportunity to design their own event using the skills and the tools and the activities and the exercises that they're familiar with, along with what we bring in the whole scale change toolkit. So day two is very hands-on, very practical. What might it look like, right? What might the activities be? Why would they be in the order they're in? Or how would you manage it each day so that you ensure that it stays on track? Day three is more about whole-scale change and large group interventions. We're mostly focused on one meeting, one event with a large group of people in the room. But whole-scale change is a process of engaging the whole system. To your point, we can't bring everybody, 100, 500, 1,000 people together, right? That's just not practical in today's world. So but the challenge is we need to engage them all. So as we imagine an intervention that takes a series of events together, what might that look like in a bigger picture? So we'll go back big picture and talk about what's the project plan, what are the touch points where applying whole scale or open space or something else, another large group method might work. And then the ending of day three is really open space, right? It's what haven't we talked about that is still burning in your mind. We could talk about what goes wrong. What do you do if it goes wrong? We could talk about how is facilitating different in a large group context versus a small group context. Whatever is still burning in the hearts and the minds of the people who will join us, right? We'll be open to having conversations about any and all that and reconfiguring ourselves to address all that.
Yeah, and we'd probably want to bring in some productive, playful principles, use of things like Lego serious play, Dixit cards, and other sort of playful techniques to supercharge some of these events that we have done in the past. So I was going to ask Alistair if he wants to share maybe a bit about the difference that he's noticed with clients that he's worked with and our practices Tricordant. What difference has things like large group interventions and whole scale change made for them, both the clients and for ourselves?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is it does the sorts of things that Paul has just described. But I've used some of the large group interventions a lot with working with healthcare systems, particularly complex healthcare systems. Now, people will be aware that there's been the development of what are called integrated care systems in English health and care system. And you have multiple stakeholders from across healthcare provision, healthcare commissioning, social care, local government, public health, voluntary community set, service users themselves, etc. And how can you design, how we've been able to design processes that get the multiple perspectives in the room, but also allow people to hear from each other, to contribute. So one of the great things about LGIs is they're inherently much more democratic. As you see, you can design them in a way, not just that the many get to decide instead of the few, but that you get a more equalization of voice, which again can give you powerful insights and obviously helps build commitment and engagement. So we've seen how, particularly with integrated care systems, for instance, in a whole number of different cases, it can really help build a shared sense of kind of making meaning, a shared sense of what the issues are and how people need to work together in the moment, and then make some decisions, gain commitment around it. And I think some of those shared experiences, because usually the other thing about LGIs is they're fun. People love being together and working together. So they generate fun and energy, which we know that creates creative conditions in people's brains for having greater, hence the whole, we love to talk about, serious fun, playful principles, how we can come up with new ideas. But you also get that energy that comes together and that share and building that sense of connection with individuals. And particularly where you've got a system where people have to work in an ongoing way, that's really helpful to build that sense of, we're in this together, we have connections. I think that's really important as well.
And my experience more recently is with COVID, separating people out and atomizing organizations into our own homes, and some people working in the office and some people in other places, and the turnover in organizations. A lot of leadership teams haven't really been able to spend the time together to really connect and form community. So using large group interventions on whole scale change and to really bring those people together is really useful, because it generates that sense of belonging that I think many people are really crying out for these days, as well as gaining an understanding and a shared vision of the direction of travel and what they're trying to achieve together, the leadership challenge that they have, and how they deliver that leadership challenge over the next few years. I was just remembering a piece of work I did with Skipton Building Society not long ago. And that was one where we had probably about 150 people go through a series of large group interventions, very much based around the whole scale change approach. We had a design team, we had the individual large group interventions, and within that we decided to blend in Lego serious play, and I really find it supercharged each event. At the beginning, the client, who's the director of that function, really was a little bit apprehensive about using Lego, and said, well, let's just try it out with this one event first of all. But partway through that first event, she was really excited by the impact of coming together as a community and the use of Lego to really bring people's voice into the room. Because there were senior leaders sat at tables with the most junior call center operators, and each of them were able to articulate quite clearly about how they think they could improve their system. And so, that experience for me really blended the whole scale change and Lego serious play together as really one of those powerful interventions that you can actually run in your organization.
It's just another way of enabling people to have a voice. Right? It's a creative, energizing way of ensuring that people get to express themselves, and in the process, learn a little bit about themselves and learn a lot about everybody else. Right? I think the phrase in the whole scale change book, we talk about uniting head and heart. Right? We talk about uniting head and heart, and most of our work is heady, right? In truth, what drives us is heart, right? And so, how do you do both? Is doing one without the other.
Yeah.
Well, and the joy of Lego serious play, Paul, is I think you do head, heart, and hands.
Yes.
And as we know, the hands know things the head doesn't realize it knows. So, and it doesn't have to be Lego serious play, but I think there's a physicality about some of these large group interventions and how you can set them up that also unleashes a kind of some learning. I think one of the dimensions that will be interesting to explore in the training is one of the things I found is that because people have got so used to COVID and basically lots of people's ways of working have flipped into much more time on Teams, on Zoom, etc. Actually, when people get together in a shared space for a workshop, there's a massive release of energy and dopamine, etc. but also people are exhausted much quicker because they're not used to that way of working. And,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering how, when we design things, we need to take account of the fact that people are now used to spending lots of time working in a hybrid or virtual way and less time face-to-face in meetings. And it's like a new challenge post-COVID. There's a great opportunity and need, but actually people have changed slightly the way they're used to working.
You know, there's a book called, I think it's called Future Shock.
Yes.
By Alvin Toffler.
Alvin Toffler, yeah.
Right. And I don't remember all of his predictions, but the one you just reminded me of, Alistair, was one of his predictions was the more high tech we become, the more high touch is required.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly, you know, and so how do you, technology is with us. How do we use it in order to engage those of them? But contact and contact and connection, right? Without it, the content part doesn't really work very well, right? So it's I think, you know, it's the only prediction I think Toffler ever made that ever stuck with me. And and I think it's really true, right? And it's still even more so maybe today. Those who have survived the hybrid virtual distributed workplace world survived because they had a culture of content that was connected. People felt connected, right? And at the head and the heart. And and so when you begin to use your hands, I think that's beautiful. That's really a really good point.
So this is some of the things that we'll be discussing on day 3 and getting into that open space and learning about how would you do this hybrid, how would you do it virtually, that point that Paul just made around the high tech you go, the high touch you need, and really thinking that through and what does that mean in those environments. So I'd like to invite everyone to come and join us on the 19th, 20th and 21st of June. It would be great to see you all there, to have those conversations, to learn from each other, but particularly to learn from Paul and Alistair as well with the experiences and the examples that they can bring to bear. I want to thank Paul and Alistair both for joining me and sharing their thoughts around these questions, and wish you a great day. Thank you, everyone.